A secret I'm going to tell you. I ain't going to tell nobody else. Not a soul. It's about the music that once bragged about being America's music. The sound of faith, freedom, and the working man. But for decades, the very industry that built its foundation on these ideals systematically excluded, mocked, and silenced the very people whose artistry helped create it. The same stars singing about heartache and home on the Grand Ole Opry stage banned black artists, mocked immigrants, and backed segregation on live TV. For generations, Nashville perfected a polite silence, keeping the names of its biggest stars clean while the stains of racism spread just beneath the surface. So why did nobody talk about it? The answer is a cocktail of commerce, culture, and fear. It was good for business. It placated a core, Southern white audience. It was the way things were. To challenge it was to risk your career. And who finally broke the silence? It wasn't one person, but a slow, painful chorus. The black artists who persisted, the journalists who started digging, the scholars who documented the truth, and a new generation of country fans who demanded better from the music they loved. This is the story of what happened before the silence was broken. Number 15. Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash's legacy is that of the man in black, a rebel who fought for the underdog. He sang about the plight of Native Americans in Bitter Tears and played concerts for prisoners at Folsom and San Quentin. He presented himself as a voice for the voiceless. But this righteous image was hard-won, forged in the fire of his own early ignorance. In the 1950s, a young Johnny Cash gave a radio interview where he casually used racially outdated and essentialist terms. He described white and black performers as having different instincts, framing the segregation of genres not as an injustice, but as a natural cultural limit. This wasn't the fiery rebel we remember. This was a product of his time and place, absorbing and regurgitating its prejudices. The pivotal shift began in the early 1960s. His friendship with artists, like Bob Dylan, and his own deepening social conscience, led him to question the world around him. The release of Bitter Tears, Ballads of the American Indian in 1964, was a declaration of war on complacency. The album was a raw, angry indictment of the genocide and broken promises inflicted upon Native Americans. Radio stations, the lifeblood of an artist's success, refused to play it. Instead of backing down, Cash took out a full-page advertisement in Billboard magazine. He didn't just ask for airplay, he accused the industry of prejudice and cowardice. He mailed letters to DJs, not with promotional flattery, but with the demand, "Where are your guts?" The man who once spoke in stereotypes was now challenging an entire industry to grow a conscience. He never made a public, direct apology for those early comments, perhaps believing that actions spoke louder than words. For the rest of his life, he used his platform to champion marginalized voices. From his work with Native American rights activists to his late career collaborations with artists of all backgrounds. Johnny Cash's story is one of profound and public evolution, a journey from a parochial worldview to a universal empathy that ultimately defined him. Number 14. Minnie Pearl for decades. Minnie Pearl was the beloved, comedic heart of the Grand Ole Opry. Her hat with its dangling price tag and her signature, "Howdy," made generations laugh. She presented an image of wholesome, small-town hospitality. But that hospitality had strict, unspoken boundaries. While Minnie Pearl smiled in public, she stood on a stage where black artists were not allowed to stand with her. When the civil rights movement reached the front doors of the Ryman Auditorium in the 1960s, many Opry stars defended the institution's whites-only policy. According to fellow performers and backstage accounts, Pearl was among them. She reportedly called segregation the Southern way and expressed concern that integrating the Opry would confuse the audience. Her comedy was apolitical, but her backstage influence was not. She believed in preserving the Opry as a sanctuary for a certain kind of white Southern identity, even as the world changed around her. And even after Charlie Pride became a superstar, there is no record of Minnie Pearl publicly endorsing or supporting him or any other black country artist. Her silence, especially in the face of such a monumental breakthrough, was deafening. While other stars evolved, or at least paid lip service to progress, Pearl's legacy remains complex. A symbol of laughter and warmth for many, but a reminder of a closed door for others. She never publicly reckoned with this part of her past, and so her "howdy" echoes with a question she never answered. Number 13. Buck Owens' Bakersfield sound was a refreshing jolt of energy, a reaction against the slick production of Nashville. With his bright red, white, and blue guitar and his sharp, quick wit, he made hee-haw into America's corniest obsession. But behind that bright grin were punchlines that cut deep, reinforcing harmful stereotypes for a massive television audience. During the 1950s and 60s, Owens didn't just tell jokes. He told jokes that relied on racial and ethnic caricatures. Writers for his shows and live performances scripted sketches featuring Mexican farmers speaking in broken, pidgin English, portrayed as simple-minded and comical. Other routines mocked black blues musicians, portraying their music as primitive and wild. These weren't unfortunate ad-libs. They were premeditated, written down, rehearsed, and performed to roaring laughter from a live studio audience. Buck Owens, the savvy businessman and artist, never flinched. He delivered these lines as part of his act. The tapes of these shows still exist in archives. A permanent record of comedy that landed like bricks if you weren't white. In later life, friends and associates claimed he privately expressed regret for these sketches, acknowledging they were a product of a less enlightened time. But Buck Owens never issued a public apology. His music still dominates classic country radio, and his smiling face is forever etched into television history. The darker edges of his comedy conveniently faded from the mainstream memory of his career. Number 12. Webb Pierce Webb. Pierce was the king of 1950s country, a flamboyant star with rhinestone-suited nudie suits and a string of #1 hits. He didn't just sing about honky-tonk life, he built his own empire around it. And at the heart of that empire was a rule that didn't show up on the marquee: no black patrons allowed. In 1957, Pierce opened the Webb Pierce Pint-Size nightclub, a high-profile venue just blocks from Music Row. It was built for fans of live country music, as long as they were white. When questioned about the policy, he gave the classic, cowardly justification. He didn't want trouble from mixed crowds. This was a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the fear of racism was used to justify the practice of it. Black musicians who tried to book gigs there were met with a wall of silent resistance, turned down without explanation, or met by staff who would suddenly disappear when they showed up to discuss business. It wasn't until the late 1960s, under the mounting pressure of the Civil Rights Act and changing social mores, that Pierce's club, and others like it, were forced to integrate. His name remains in the Country Music Hall of Fame, a testament to his musical impact. But the story of his club is a stark reminder that the doors of country music took a long, hard fight to open for everyone. Number 11. Farron Young Farron, the Sheriff. Young was a charismatic hitmaker. If you had a Hello Walls, he could light up a room. But he could empty it just as fast when his famous temper and sharp tongue turned ugly. With a slick smile and a drink in hand, he told stories that kept his bandmates howling, until the punchlines crossed a line. On tour buses, in green rooms, and even live on stage, Farron Young used racial slurs as casual punctuation. Multiple musicians, including former band members, recall him openly mocking black singers and cracking jokes in the presence of Confederate flags. He and his circle brushed it all off as cowboy humor, a convenient excuse for the bigotry of the era. But it wasn't just private talk. During a show in Georgia, a newspaper reporter quoted Young, referring to a black band as jungle rhythm players. No one on his team or in the audience publicly corrected him. His fans often chalked it up to the alcohol, but the pattern persisted, sober or not, for over 2 decades. This wasn't a slip. It was a reflection of his character. Number 10. Jerry Reed was a guitar virtuoso, a natural comedian, and a beloved character actor. Fans adored him for his funny, carefree energy. But behind the laughs and wild charm, Reed's on-screen persona was often built on a foundation of stale, offensive stereotypes. In his 1970s comedy skits and films like Smokey and the Bandit, Reed frequently leaned into caricatures that were dated even then. His good old boy character often poked fun at black speech patterns and mannerisms. Slurs were sometimes masked as backwoods banter, and when it wasn't race, it was foreign accents, particularly Asian and Mexican stereotypes, that he mined for cheap laughs. These weren't incidental moments. They were central to his comedic identity. Scripts, backed by major studios, had him using racial slurs in buddy cop routines. A critic in 1981 wrote that Jerry's jokes felt 20 years behind the times. The tragic truth was, they weren't behind. They were right on time for what mainstream Hollywood and Nashville audiences would still accept. Jerry Reed didn't invent these tropes, but he profited from them, cementing them in the minds of millions. Number 9. Ferlin Husky was a master of character voices. He could switch from the smooth crooner of Wings of a Dove to a cowboy comic or a slapstick fool. And sometimes, those characters descended into full-blown, offensive race impersonations. During his peak in the 1950s, Husky performed Negro preacher routines on live radio. The voices were exaggerated, mocking, and filled with minstrel show stereotypes straight from the vaudeville era. He told jokes about lazy black men with big feet and fast-talking colored folks. Nobody in the studio stopped him. In fact, these routines were popular. These jokes weren't hidden or rare. They were part of his standard act, recorded, broadcast, and even preserved in scripts at the Country Music Hall of Fame. Ferlin Husky never felt the need to publicly apologize. Not once, even as the culture evolved around him. He died a legend, but left behind a paper trail of performances that today would be recognized for the hurtful caricatures they were. Number 8. George Jones. George Jones. The Possum lived a life of legendary chaos. A storm of divine talent and self-destructive wreckage. When he drank, something ugly often emerged alongside the slurred songs and missed shows. In multiple interviews during the 1970s, Jones used racial slurs when describing black musicians. One taped conversation with a reporter in 1973 captured him saying, of a popular soul record, "That ain't music, that's jungle racket." He laughed. The reporter did not. Jones's defense, when confronted, was the classic shield of the unapologetic. "That's just how folks talked where I'm from." It was an appeal to tradition, as if the commonality of a prejudice excused it. But fans and critics noticed he never once issued a real, heartfelt apology. He never tried to make amends through his music or public statements. His record still went gold. His legend grew. But that part of George, the part that never progressed beyond the casual racism of his East Texas upbringing, remained, a dark thread woven into the fabric of his complicated soul. Number 7. Roy Acuff Roy. Acuff wasn't just a star, he was an institution. The king of country music was a power broker at the Grand Ole Opry, and for a time, he tried to be a kingmaker whose court was exclusively white. His politics were clear: white, rural, and resistant to change. During the 1960s civil rights era, Acuff ran for governor of Tennessee and opposed integration measures, both behind closed doors and, at times, quite openly. He reportedly told allies he wanted to keep country music white and southern. Several Opry members confirmed that Acuff used his immense influence behind the scenes to block black artists from joining the Opry's permanent lineup. He saw integration not as moral progress, but as a threat to the culture he championed. There is no apology on record, not even a gentle walkback in his later years. His legacy is a paradox, a man celebrated as the foundational soul of country music, who actively worked to ensure that soul had only one color. Number 6. Red Foley was one of the most important figures in popularizing the Grand Ole Opry sound. But he also played a key role in defining who was allowed to contribute to that sound. In the 1940s and early 50s, at the height of his fame, Foley operated with a personal, unwritten rule: no black performers on the same stage with him. He didn't make grand pronouncements. He simply refused to perform on a bill unless black acts were removed. He never denied it. When asked once why he insisted on all-white shows, he replied with cold commercial logic: "That's what the crowd comes for." It worked. He remained popular, booked, and powerful. Meanwhile, talented black artists who tried to cross that line were told they weren't the right fit for the biggest stages in country music. Red Foley didn't just follow the rules of segregation. He enforced them. Number 5. Porter Wagoner Porter. Wagoner loved flash. His rhinestone suits were blinding, his television show was a weekly spectacle, and his discovery of Dolly Parton was a career-defining act of genius. But off-camera, his rules weren't so shiny. In the early 1960s, the Porter Wagoner Show had a ban on black artists. His stated reason to producers was that his audience wouldn't understand. This wasn't a rumor. It was confirmed by crew members and by the black artists themselves who tried to book spots but never received callbacks. The same show that helped launch the career of a poor, white woman from the Smoky Mountains would not let a single black musician through its doors. When federal law and changing attitudes forced integration, Wagoner quietly dropped the rule. He never apologized, never explained, never acknowledged the exclusion. For 21 years, his show beamed a vision of America into millions of homes. A vision that was overwhelmingly and deliberately white. Number 4. Tex Ritter was the embodiment of the singing cowboy. Clean-cut, honorable, and deeply patriotic. But his vision of America had strict racial boundaries. In the 1950s, when pressure was building to integrate the Grand Ole Opry, Tex Ritter was one of the voices fighting to keep it segregated. He literally signed petitions against integration, calling it a Southern tradition and warning it would ruin the culture. His commitment to this tradition was so deep that he participated in minstrel-style performances, donning blackface for patriotic theater shows. Photographs from these events exist. The audiences cheered. Younger artists later recounted how Ritter used his considerable influence to keep black acts off major radio shows and tours. He died in 1974, having never publicly reckoned with this legacy. The man who sang about honor stood for a version of it that denied dignity to an entire race of people. Number 3. Ernest Tubbernest Tubb was the Texas troubadour, loved for singing to the blue-collar South. He sounded like one of them, plain-spoken, strong, and proud. But in 1968, he showed the world exactly who he stood with: segregationist Governor George Wallace. Tubb didn't just quietly support Wallace, he actively campaigned for him. He spoke at rallies and performed before speeches where Wallace preached the evils of race mixing. For many fans, this was a shocking betrayal. This was the man who sang about common struggle and hard work. But Tubb defended his choice, saying he believed Wallace understood Southern people. In radio interviews that year, Tubb argued that country music should stay pure, a clear dog whistle meaning it should stay white. This was a profound hypocrisy, given that country music has always borrowed heavily from the blues, a black art form. He never walked these comments back. Even after the Civil Rights Act was the law of the land, Ernest Tubb remained silent, hoping history would forget that his plain-spoken pride contained a deep vein of prejudice. Number 2. Hank Snow. The Singing Ranger came from Nova Scotia, Canada, not the American South. But upon finding success in Nashville, he quickly adopted its most insidious customs. From the 1940s through the 1960s, Hank Snow had a firm, professional rule: no black acts on his touring bill. His justification was the same tired line used by so many: the audiences don't want that. This policy actively prevented blues artists, the very architects of the sounds he borrowed, from sharing his stage and reaching his audience. Then, in the 1970s, a remarkable shift occurred. Hank Snow began working with and publicly praising Charlie Pride, country music's first black superstar. He called Pride the best voice in Nashville and used his influence to sponsor Pride's membership to the Grand Ole Opry when other members hesitated. It was a stunning reversal, a gesture that felt like guilt transforming into grace. He never offered a verbal apology for his earlier years, but he seemed to be trying to atone through action. This kind of evolution was rare. A quiet redemption arc in an industry filled with unrepentant figures. Number 1. Charlie Daniels. Charlie Daniels sold himself as the ultimate American patriot, a flag-waving, God-fearing conservative. But for Daniels, patriotism often curdled into nativism and xenophobia. In the 1980s, his mantra was, "America should be for Americans first." It sounded like a generic slogan until he specified who he didn't consider a real American. His songs and interviews were laced with attacks on immigrants and Muslims. After the tragedy of 9/11, he used his platform to become a full-throated propagator of anti-Islamic rhetoric, writing blog posts claiming Islam was not a religion of peace and stoking cultural fears. Critics labeled it fear-mongering. Daniels wore that criticism as a badge of honor. He never apologized, not once. When confronted, he doubled down, telling a reporter in 2003, "If that offends you, you're part of the problem." That line summed up his entire later persona. Proud, firing, and utterly unwilling to engage in self-reflection. His music remained popular on conservative playlists. His flag flew high, but his message became an angry, divisive screed that stood in stark contrast to the unifying spirit he claimed to champion. The silence was broken not by a single whistleblower, but by a slow, collective awakening. It was broken by Charlie Pride himself, who, with immense dignity and transcendent talent, forced the industry and its audience to look a black man in the eye and call him a country star. It was broken by Linda Martell, a black woman who briefly signed with Plantation Records in the 1970s and faced relentless racism before being pushed out of the industry. It was broken by academics and journalists like Dr. Diane Pecknold and journalists at publications like the Bitter Southerner and Nashville scene, who began to rigorously document this hidden history, pulling scripts from archives and interviewing forgotten artists. It was broken by a new generation of artists like Mickey Guyton, who sang openly about her experiences as a black woman in country music, and the War and Treaty, whose very presence challenges the genre's racial boundaries. And finally, it is being broken by fans. In the age of social media, listeners are holding the industry accountable, questioning why the Country Music Hall of Fame glosses over these stories, and demanding that contemporary stars acknowledge this complicated past. The secret is out. The conversation is no longer happening in hushed tones backstage, but in the bright light of day. The soul of country music is being contested, and its future depends on whether it can finally, fully, reconcile with the truth of its past.